everyone, and welcome to a brand new mini-series entitled Grapes in the Desert. We are in the midst of a very challenging season with this pandemic. And whenever you talk about a challenging season in your life, oftentimes a metaphor that is used is the desert. When people are going through hardship, they will say, this is a wilderness experience for me. Because when you just look at the landscape of the desert, and this is some drone footage from Israel, you quickly identify with the challenging times of your life as a desert, because the desert is this very bland, bleak landscape. It's got all of these hills that look the same, which makes it very disorienting. And when you go walking through and you see no color and all you see is tan and brown, you go, this is not what I signed up for. This is not what I was expecting or looking for in my life. And you immediately ask yourself the question, how long am I going to have to be in this desert? Because the desert is unrelenting. The desert is deeply, deeply challenging. And we oftentimes are ushered into the desert because of poor decisions we have made. But more often than not, we're ushered into the desert because life happens. We lose a job. We get a negative medical report. There is a tragic accident. Somebody hurts us in some way. There's a natural disaster, or there's even a pandemic. And all of a sudden you find yourself in this desert landscape. And because you don't know how long you're going to be there, one of the things that you recognize really quickly is that how you navigate the desert is really, really important. In fact, I love how Gary Burge puts it in his book, The Bible and the Land. He wrote an entire chapter just on the desert. And he says this, he says, wilderness experiences can either become remarkable opportunities for renewal in faith, or they can become opportunities for bitterness and anger. In a word, when each person stands in the wilderness of their own desolation, they must decide how to respond. And my hope for all of us, whether it's here in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic or any deserts we experience in our lives, that we would respond well. And that's why I've entitled this series, Grapes in the Desert. Now, this isn't just some clever title I came up with. It's actually something I took from the book of Hosea. So in Hosea chapter 9, God is talking about those early days when he brought Israel out of Egypt and they were in the desert together. This is what God says in recounting that story in Hosea 9:1. He says, when I found Israel, it was like finding grapes in the desert. Now, is this just a metaphor, or is this actually something that can happen from time to time? And the answer is the latter. And I really love how J. Glenn Taylor, in the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary of the Old Testament, Volume 5. Okay, that's a mouthful. That J. Glenn Taylor says this about this passage. He says the background here is of a weary, parched desert traveler who is delighted and refreshed by the freakish discovery of a vine full of grapes in the desert. A freakish discovery. I love that description. And he's saying that it's a parched desert traveler who in the desert stumbles upon some grapes. And there is this joy and this delight that surges in your soul. And this is what I want for all of us. This is why it's entitled Grapes in the Desert. Because what I want to do in this series is that in each episode, I want to look at a key idea that if we are able to live out in response to our desert landscape, I believe that we will experience these grapes in the desert. And so for this episode, I want to briefly look at a story in 1 Kings 19 in connection to Elijah. Now, Elijah has just fought against the Baal prophets at a place called Mount Carmel. And this is less than 100 years after Solomon has dedicated the temple in Jerusalem. The number one god in the land is Baal. And so Elijah has a contest with the Baal prophets. Then all the Baal prophets are killed. And Jezebel, who is a queen in the north of the land of Israel, she says to Elijah, I'm going to kill you for this. And so Elijah hightails it from Mount Carmel to Mount Sinai. And we don't know what route he took, but it's a minimum, the shortest route, 300 miles. He goes into the desert because he is experiencing a desert in his life. And once he gets into the Sinai desert, he has some words for God, and he is not a happy prophet. And he says this to God at Mount Sinai. He says, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. And Elijah has this speech so well rehearsed that 4 verses later, when he gets to speak to God again, he says the exact same thing verbatim. And so in the midst of this thing he is saying to God, he says, I am the only one left. This is one of the realities of being in a desert experience. Is that not only can it be very disruptive and disorienting and discouraging, but it can feel very, very lonely and isolating. And for Elijah, he's having this desert experience in his life. And he says to God, I am the only one left. And then God responds to Elijah, and he says a couple of things, but then he concludes his response by saying this. God says, yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him. God says, Elijah, I know that you feel isolated and alone, but I need you to understand you are not alone. But that's how we feel in a desert landscape. And so when you think about this in terms of what we're going through right now, with this social distancing, it's like this awareness is all around us. We have to maintain our distance from one another. There has to be this gap. There has to be this isolation. And so you could say the social distancing is a reality we understand, but you can also say we intimately understand this isolation that we are going through in the midst of this pandemic. And we can easily associate that to the isolation that we feel in the midst of other desert experiences that we have gone through. And maybe for some of you, what has made this pandemic so challenging is that you were already in a desert before this thing happened. And now it's like you have a desert on top of a desert, and it's just really, really challenging for you in this particular season. And so the question becomes for all of us that as we navigate a desert landscape, how can we overcome our sense of isolation? How can we experience grapes in the desert when we are feeling this strong sense of isolation from one another? And I think one of the answers comes in one word, and it's the word creativity. And here's where I'm going with this. T.S. Eliot was once talking about the creative process, and he said something very counterintuitive and paradoxical to how a lot of creatives often talk about the creative process. But here's what T.S. Eliot wrote. He said, when forced to work with any strict framework, the imagination is taxed to its utmost and will produce its richest ideas. Given total freedom, the work is likely to sprawl. See, you hear people say all the time, like, don't give me any boundaries, don't give me any limitations, just let me create, just let me do my own thing. And T.S. Eliot says, actually, you want some kind of restriction or some set of limitations, because when the mind is being limited, it actually creates its best. The best results come from that limitation. Or you could just say this, that creativity flourishes within restrictions. And friends, we are actually seeing that happen right now in the midst of this pandemic. Most of us have been watching the news or clips on YouTube or, on our various news apps, and we are seeing things like the 5-minute clap in New York City, where even though the social distancing is real and it's very, very much enforced there, as we're finding out with lots of people getting tickets and all of that, is that everybody is clapping for 5 minutes. And you've probably watched the video and just heard the reverberation of everybody being united, even though that they are being distant. For many of you, you saw this video clip of the New York City Fire Department cheering and clapping and sirens going. The medical workers at the hospital across the street saying, "We are with you. Thank you for all the work that you are doing." Many of you have probably seen all of these drive-by birthday parties where these kids can't have these birthday parties, and yet they're on the side of the street and people are driving with balloons and bubbles and signs and dogs and these big blow-up unicorn horse-looking things. And what I love about this is that this girl is probably 8 years old and she's hanging out the window and she is celebrating her friend's birthday in a creative and imaginative way in order to let that other person know, hey, we may be isolated, but we are not disconnected. And friends, this is where we really need to wrap our arms and minds around, is that we may be isolated, but we're not disconnected. But we will be disconnected if we don't find creative ways to break through and connect with other people. Because whether this is the pandemic we're talking about, or maybe you're watching or listening to this a year, 2, 3 down the road and you're going through your own desert, people don't survive deserts on their own. That when you are ushered into a desert experience and everything gets stripped away, you've got God and you've got others. That's what you've got when you are in the desert. And people do not survive deserts on their own. And God wants us to connect with Him, but God also desires that we connect with other people, because as we are being reminded in the season that we are going through, we were made to be in relationship with other people. This has been very, very disorienting to be distancing ourselves from others. And so here's what I want to encourage you to do. Here's what I'm calling just my calls to action for you. The first is this: reach out if you're alone. If you are someone who is struggling, you've been going through a desert for a while and nobody knows about it, let somebody know what you are trying to navigate. I always say that it's not that people need to know, it's that the right people need to know. And for many of us, we have been trying to navigate our deserts alone, and it is not the way we get through desert experiences. The second call to action is this, and particularly for those of us who are in the midst of this season. Be creative and imaginative in the midst of these current circumstances. Find ways to be creative. Find ways to connect with other people. Maybe for some of you prior to this, you had only used FaceTime occasionally, but now you're recognizing this is great to be able to see other people. For some of you, you had never heard of Zoom before, or you are definitely not proficient in the Zoom interface, but now you're meeting as small groups or you're getting families together. I had one of my neighbors said, hey, over Easter Sunday, we had 18 people on Zoom and they were all connecting, something that they would have never done. They never would have gotten 18 people together for Easter in the first place, and yet they did so because they utilized Zoom, or whether it's Google Hangouts. Be creative. Find ways to utilize the technology that we have to connect people, to connect to people in this time of being distanced. I know that this was a huge moment and experience for my wife and I just recently. For those of you who watched Life in the 40, you will know that I just turned 40, and one of my really good friends was turning 40 2 days after me. And so we actually met over Zoom because he was wrestling with the same kinds of things that I was wrestling with that I shared in that episode. And so he and his wife got on their couch and they put their laptop on their coffee table, and Shalyn and I jumped on our couch and put our laptop on our coffee table. And for an hour and a half, they're several states apart, we just had this amazing conversation about life and family in this pandemic and turning 40 and what God was trying to teach us in this season. And we got done and we said, why have we not done this before? Like, we have been in this Nashville area for more than 3 years, and this is a couple that's back in Michigan. And we have just not had very many meaningful conversations because we keep saying, oh, we're going to get together at some point. And this is, pre-pandemic. And then we don't get together. And then now we're sitting down and we're going, this is rich and it is meaningful. Now, my kids are actually writing real physical letters. This is like a newfound reality for them. And they're writing friends and they're writing family. And it's like been such a joy for them because they have never really engaged in this medium. So what does it look like for you? What does it look like for you to be creative? That in the midst of this desert reality, we are isolated, but we're not disconnected. And if we're creative and imaginative and we reach out, we have the opportunity to connect with people in a way that maybe we haven't connected with them for a very long time. And in doing so, I believe that we are experiencing these grapes in the desert, these joys and delights that nourish us, that encourage us, and that empower us as we navigate this desert landscape. So friends, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for listening. If you know anybody who would benefit from this series, please share this with them. I know that we are all trying to be as helpful as we can to one another, and maybe this is one way that you can bless someone else with some words that will help them through this season. So thanks again for watching. Thanks for listening, and may we all walk out this text well in our lives.